Good afternoon, everyone. By now, skip the introductions so you know who I am. I want to give you the rest of the history that I didn't give you this morning. When we were approached by our customer, and I actually forgot my visual aid because I got this at ICRA. We use this as the blueprint for creating our initial products, our Murabaha and our Ijara products. It's mentioned in the papers that are handed out. An Introduction to Islamic Finance by Justice Usmani. Good recommended reading for an introduction. The customer that originally approached us, who had financing from the United Bank of Kuwait, and Abdul Qadir Thomas, who you saw earlier, was the loan officer who did the transaction for the United Bank of Kuwait. We originally looked to say, okay, well, I got a product now, it seems to be working for them, why don't we just use their product? This is before I joined the bank, finishing my career as an intellectual property lawyer. And I looked at that and said, no, we can't use somebody else's product, we got to create our own. But we also started studying as to what makes a good product. And I went so far as to get a postgraduate diploma in Islamic banking and insurance. And we said, you know, the product that United Bank of Kuwait was using, we think has kind of drifted from the ideal. So we created our own Ijara that was trying to sort of fix the mistakes that we thought were there. As I said, the reason why we went off on quite a big tangent into our Murabaha product is due to tax issues. If you are a nonprofit religious foundation, then you probably don't pay real estate taxes on the property you own. With a Murabaha transaction, the bank owns the property, but it owns it briefly. With an Ijara transaction, we own the property for the duration of the financing. Well, if we're financing a nonprofit and the nonprofit doesn't own the property, then does that mean that there is no real estate tax exemption that applies? That's why we diverted away from Ijara. We have since found solutions to that problem. But as a result, creating the Murabaha product, we found that that worked very well for houses, as I mentioned this morning. The Ijara transaction we have used for residential home finance on occasion, but it is a more difficult product for us to use. Let's take a step back and look at what the product really is. Technically, it's an Ijara wa Iktina, a sale with lease. The focus is really the purchase commitment. The customer is going to buy the property from us at cost. So the Murabaha, buy for 100, sell for 150. With an Ijara, we buy for 100, we sell for 100. But we keep title to the property. It's only after the 100 has been paid do we sign over the ownership of the property. In the meantime, the customer is using our property. So they're also paying rent for the privilege. Now, this also is structured to fit within an exemption to the prohibition on banks owning property. There are two OCC interpretive letters, as I mentioned. Both of them were obtained by the United Bank of Kuwait. I believe you have one of them in your materials, but the other one is interpretive letter 806. The other is 867. 806 was the first one. That was the one that dealt with the Ijara. And it basically says the same kind of thing. Looks like a duck, smells like a duck, you can eat it like a duck. The advantages of an Ijara product is it's very flexible. Again, as I said this morning, when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. We have been able to use an Ijara for construction financing. We tried to get Istisna approved by the regulators, and they said, you can't do it the way you tried. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but you can't do it the way you tried. But we made an Ijara work, and then we didn't need any additional approvals because they already approved Ijara. We've been able to use it as a line of credit product in some cases. It has a lot of flexibility built into it. There are certain disadvantages, though, and part of that comes specifically from the regulatory structure. As a bank, we can do bank-like things. And we have to be registered and licensed and all those great things, but what do you know, we're a bank and we are licensed in Illinois. When we start doing business in other states, we have to check each state to see whether or not we need additional licensing or whether we can continue to do the kinds of things that we do in Illinois in whatever other state we're looking at the time. That is a state-by-state analysis. But now let's look at an ijara. When we do an ijara transaction, who buys the property, who sells the property, and who leases the property? For an ijara transaction, we form a separate subsidiary, separate LLC for each property. And the argument is, if I go and I visit you in your house, and I break my leg, and I sue, I'm going to sue the house owner. But you're not the house owner. You're the house owner. And if I win, and I win more than the entire value of your house, now I'm coming after his house, which is owned by him also. So by putting each property into a separate LLC, we isolate one property from the other. But now, the landlord and the seller of the property is not the bank, it's the LLC. Which means, does the LLC need to be licensed as a bank for each and every ijara transaction we do? Again, that's a state-by-state analysis. But that's why we only offer ijara in a few states. We typically use it more for commercial financing than we do for residential. And the other reason is because with the use of the LLC, the COBM, the cost of being Muslim, is higher with an ijara than it is with a murabaha. With a murabaha transaction, the additional costs caused by the structure is about $300, $350, regardless of whether it's a $50,000 transaction or a $4 million transaction. You're talking about a $350 price differential. With an LLC involved, you've just tripled that. And it is surprising the number of people who are going to make the most expensive purchase they will ever make who are going to fight over $300. We'll just move on from that one. Now, what makes an ijara contract proper? It is a sale of a property. It has to be a proper sale. We talked about that this morning. It has to involve the transfer of an agreed upon asset for a period of time at an agreed price, defined asset. Now, the lessor must retain ownership. That's the LLC. We do that. Property must have some value, kind of simple stuff here. The leased property must not be consumable through normal use of the property. I can't rent you my lunch. I'm not going to get it back in any form that I'd really like to see it in. The period of the lease must be clearly defined. The use of the leased asset must be within an agreed scope of the use of the asset. You know, I can't lease you a home and now you're running a business out of it. That's a violation of the lease terms. The lessee must compensate the lessor for damage caused by misuse or negligence. Coming right out of the checklist in here. Any question? Look it up. The lessor must retain the risk of loss, though, for anything that is outside of the control of the lessee. If you are using the house and you're smoking in bed and you burn down the house, that's your problem. If it gets hit by lightning and it burns down, that's my problem. Now, the rental rate has to be defined at the beginning of the term of the lease, but it can change throughout the lease as long as the mechanism by which it changes is agreed ahead of time. So you can tie the rate of rental to an index. You can say your rent is prime plus 1. You can say your rental rate is LIBOR plus 2. You can say it's the equity REIT dividend yield plus 2. You can have a non-interest-based rate by which you calculate the rent. It just has to be agreed in advance, and it has to be outside the control of the landlord. So I can't say, next year we're changing your rent. Now, the lease can begin at any time after the property is actually or constructively delivered to the lessee, regardless of whether it's actually used. But just as you can't sell what you don't own, you can't lease what you don't own also. So you have to own it before the lease is scheduled to begin. Now, the lease terminates by necessity at the point where the property can't be used anymore. If it's irreparably destroyed, the lease technically comes to an end. Now, if you caused it to be irreparably destroyed, then you may owe me damages as a result of your negligence, but at least the lease at that point has terminated. Now, there are certain costs of ownership. The costs of ownership have to be paid by the owner, but you can factor those costs into the rent. There was a question that was raised this morning, and this is exactly the answer here. So for instance, the landlord is required to pay the taxes on it. Okay, that's what we do. We pay the taxes on an Amja transaction. But we can charge the tenant as rent for the amount that we pay out on taxes. And think about this. This is what you do with a conventional lease anyway. If you are paying rent to a landlord, how did the landlord come up with the amount of your rent? Well, it's going to come from a number of factors. What is the common area maintenance cost to the landlord? What is the insurance cost to the landlord? What are the taxes being paid by the landlord? How much does the landlord pay on his or her interest-bearing loan through which he bought the building? That's going to be factored into your rent also. In the case of an Amja transaction, we divide it out. You know, we want to provide clarity as to what is coming from where. So we have different components of rent. We have one component of rent, which is our profit. That is the A component rent. We have the B component rent, and the B component rent consists of the items that are changing on a more regular basis. So we may say your A component rent is fixed for 20 years. We may say your A component rent is fixed for 5 years. Your B component rent is going to change every year. And that's where we're going to cover the taxes and the insurance that we are going to pay, but we're going to charge you as rent those costs. Now, there is some concern over whether an end-of-lease transfer can be by gift, a unilateral, a bilateral promise. That was discussed earlier today. The regulators pretty much want a committed disposal plan. You know, they prefer a bilateral agreement. Unfortunately, I don't remember all of the back and forth to give you a better answer than that. But this has been a fairly carefully negotiated provision of our contracts. Now, I have a few minutes left, so let's talk about some of the practical application issues. Now, one of the items, as I said, is you can have rent tied to an index, and that index can change. And often that index is an interest-based index. And some people say, how can you have a rent of prime plus 1 when prime is an interest-based index? Well, I could also have it tied to pork bellies, and I could say it's the pork belly future contract plus 2. But would you be under any illusion that somehow you are consuming pork if that's the index that I am using by which to charge you your rent? Well, no, you are charging a cost for use of the property. It's just the index that I'm using. Same answer if I'm tying this to LIBOR. Because some people raised the concern, I went to an Islamic finance conference. They said, oh, isn't this terrible? I came back and said, okay, now I got a project. So I worked on coming up with a non-interest-based index. And we did some modeling, and we did some analysis, and we came up with an alternative, and we said, isn't this great? Don't you want this? And no one wanted this. All of the customers' concerns were, how do I know I'm getting a good deal? How do I know if this is fair? How do I know what to expect in the future? Well, if it's tied to an index, you never know what it's like in the future. But then you get into the issue of Sharia arbitrage, which is, okay, fine, I'll take your weird index until it's not in my favorite anymore. and then I'm going to refinance with Guidance, or then I'm going to refinance with University Bank. And you can have an index that performs differently just up to the point where the customer decides it's no longer a good deal for them, at which point they're no longer your customer anymore. Now, late payments. Same answer as before. You can have a late payment to encourage responsibility, but not to punish hardship. If a customer comes to us and says, I can't pay because I don't have the money, no late payment is due. Same answer. Prepayments. With a murabaha, this is a big issue. With an ijara, the issue goes away entirely. Buy for 100, sell for 100. You need to move after 6 months, you pay the balance of the 100, any fractional month's rent, you're done. Much simpler. Secondary market, we talked about this earlier. In the case of an ijara transaction and divan bank, this is necessarily a portfolio product. This is not being sold anywhere. This is staying in our portfolio. It's our money being invested, not a Freddie Mac investing. But this can be sold, and we have at times offered as an investment product the opportunity to invest in someone else's ijara transaction. And the reason why is it is not a debt-based transaction. It is a real estate-based transaction. You're actually buying a percentage ownership in the LLC that owns the property. You're not buying the debt that is owed, and that is a substantive difference between either an ijara or a musharaka and a murabaha. And with that, I will yield the probably seconds remaining of my time and look forward to the questions.
3.5 minutes, but thank you. Fantastic.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. First of all, let me make reference to the interpretive letters of the OCC, because I think it's very important for anyone who is interested in this topic. So the Office of the Controller, the Comptroller of the Currency, this is basically one of the main bank regulators, and banks don't put out new products, and they're not free to kind of put out any product that they want. They need to have some approval for the product, and once there is approval, they can kind of work from there. So in the Murabaha article, I put the entire letter as an appendix, and it kind of shows you like some of the philosophy and some of the theory behind it. There is another interpretive letter from the OCC concerning ijara as well. It's much longer. It's about 18 pages. But there are some issues of that original ijara, which is described in that interpretive letter, which is, I think, good to see how things first were started and approved, and goes back to that question of the fact that banks cannot own real estate. So if they can't own real estate, how are they going to be able to lease property? The United Bank of Kuwait had another approach. There basically is, okay, we're only owning it in name, really. Otherwise, everything, the upkeep, maintenance, everything is on the homeowner, and we just have legal title and nothing beyond that. But here in this model, it looks like you create an LLC. So when you create the LLC, now this is no longer a bank, or did you say in some states has to?
It's a state-by-state analysis.
Okay, so do you have any where it's required to be like a bank, or in any states? Or
in some states, it's exempt from additional regulation.
Okay. So by creating the LLC, at least in some states, the LLC actually owns property. So you've now removed this big issue with respect to the bank and the bank owning property, and therefore being able actually to lease it. Because if you don't own it, you can't lease it. And if a bank can't own property, and then obviously from a Sharia point of view, if they don't really own it, they're not going to be able to lease it. So this LLC was an important, I think, step, inshallah, in removing that very problematic issue that you see in the original interpretive letter. So once again, my job is to go over, review 2 of the articles that you have. One is by, again, Dr. Ma'an al-Quda in his paper on Islamic mortgage companies in the US. Pages 5 through 10 are about ijara. And then Dr. Salah al-Sawi has a separate paper, questions about ijara of Divan Bank. However, I must warn you concerning Dr. Salah al-Sawi's paper. And I'm looking for any response. So, inshallah, I hope that Dr. Salah's paper is fixed before, if there's any distribution of it or put on the website, because if you look at it closely, there's actually questions, and then there's response, and then there's some statements in English. And sometimes if you read the Arabic and the English contradict one another on a couple of cases. Because the English is actually, this was put to Sheikh Salah from Ma'an al-Quda, and so some of his comments stayed in there. So sometimes when they differed, those comments are still in there. So you kind of have to ignore the English when you're reading Dr. Salah's paper about Ijara and Divan Bank. Ignore the English, and inshallah you'll get Dr. Salah's. Otherwise it'll be very confusing, because as I was preparing this, I was very confused why the Arabic says one thing and the English says something else. So there's a number of points. There's a number of points that they go through. In fact, because I failed to mention this when I was speaking about the previous guidance contract, Dr. Ma'an al-Quda, I'm going to jump to his conclusion before I go back to some of the points that he makes. Dr. Ma'an al-Quda, after reviewing some of the contradictions or deviations that he found in this, I use this term now, in this contract, he concluded, having said this, more than one critical violation of Islamic ijara has been combined in this contract. Due to all these violations, this contract is not a valid ijara one. It characterizes the relationship between the bank and the client as a lender who advances an interest-bearing loan to a borrower. And also his conclusion on guidance also was pretty much the same, but unfortunately, sometimes when you're speaking and you're just trying to make some points, sometimes you forget some important points as well. So he also made that point, inshallah, with respect to the diminishing partnership of guidance. So what they've done, what both of them have done, has actually gone through the ijara contract of Divan and highlighted some of the issues that they have. For example, in the case of default, and of course many of these issues are related to secondary kind of cases, or cases that might come up. So in the case of the default, in the event the owner declares the lessee in default, the owner may collect as part of the rent payable rent from lessee until new tenant can be found, and may collect the difference between any new tenant pays and the rent lessee has agreed to pay. So here's kind of a technical issue, and actually the two sheikhs are a little bit divided on this. The question is, did the contract come to an end or not? If they are actually declaring an end to the contract, then Sheikh Ma'an says that if the contract has actually come to an end, then the individual is no longer responsible for any rent that would have to be paid after that time. Sheikh Salah emphasized the fact that a lease contract is what is known as a binding contract on both parties, and one cannot unilaterally escape the requirements of that contract. And so therefore one can be bound and required to live up to the demands of that contract. So Sheikh Salah did not see a big issue with that. With respect to repossession and warranties, the property is being given as is and without warranty, and with no recourse for any known or later discovered faults or problems. So basically, again, if the bank is the owner of the property, again, they're leasing, and this is the problem that you get with some of the models that have been done throughout the Muslim world of ijara. The question of is the person leasing or is he buying, and you know, where does he actually stand? Is he purchasing it? Is he leasing? Sometimes it gets a little bit blurry. So if the bank is leasing the property, that means that the bank is the owner of the property and is simply leasing the property to someone else. So many of you are renting. Now, as I said, you could put when the person decides how much rent you have to pay, he puts all sorts of things into consideration. But once he puts it there, it's fixed, right? If those things change, he cannot do anything. He cannot do anything about it. So the burden is on the owner to take care of many things, typically in the Sharia, and these are some of the points that both Dr. Ma'in and Sheikh Salah have noticed. So for example, fixing, as Dr. Ma'in notes, that fixing faults or problems discovered later is the responsibility of the lessor. It's the responsibility of the person who still owns the property and is simply leasing the property to yeah. Oh, was that for me? Another aspect of the agreement, it says that the lessee shall be responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of property at its own expense. So here's that issue again. Now, normal wear and tear. So if you are, for example, if you are renting a house, because again, lease is essentially the same. If you are renting the house, it's kind of established what you have to do. But the actual upkeep and the maintenance of the house in general is not your business, right? If you see, for example, the paint peeling or something like that, usually you call your landlord, and the landlord comes and sends someone over to fix it, because again, it's his property, and he's probably more concerned about the well-being of his property, even sometimes than the one who's renting. Sometimes the one who's renting lets problems go, and they become bigger problems. So it is established and is agreed by the different Sharia standards that the upkeep and the maintenance of the property is a burden on the lessor, the one who owns the property, in this case, Divan Bank. And the agreement seems to state very clearly differently. And again, the lessee is supposed to provide all necessary assistance in obtaining disaster protection and insurance and so forth. This should also be the burden on the owner of the property. Damage, if any is damage, so the lessee is responsible for any damage to the property, and any insurance funds paid the owner shall be kept by the owner and applied to the repair of the property. So the lessee is responsible for getting the insurance, but then the one really who is benefiting from the insurance. No? Okay.
That's a misinterpretation of the intent behind the contract. The assistance in...
What's law without misinterpretation, right?
The assistance that we are expecting from our customer is because, for instance, if you have an insurance adjuster who's going to have to come and look at the property in order to assess its insurable value, we need to have our customer let that person in to do it. So we need the participation of our customer in getting the insurance done. Often the customer will identify proper insurance and we will pay for it. So it is our obligation to pay for the insurance, but we are expecting our customer to help in that process.
Okay, but just prior to that, it says lessee is responsible for any damage to the property during the term of this agreement. Is that right?
It should be only the...
This is your contract.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've looked at that contract.
All right.
It should be our responsibility to handle certain catastrophic losses.
Okay.
But what is catastrophic and what is as a result of normal use? And if the customer is entirely in control of the property, I would argue that that standard of what the customer would be liable to address because of their exclusivity of use is higher than it would be. It doesn't mean it's entirely
Yeah,
their
okay.
issue.
So that's fine. There's some limits to what is his responsibility and what is our
Yes.
responsibility. But here it just says lessee is responsible for any damage to the property.
Well, that's why we have the insurance in place. Yeah, you're right. That is something that you probably ought to clarify.
Okay, all right, inshallah.
I will give you that one.
Oh, thank you, mashallah. I've been here all day and I finally got one, mashallah. There's also a portion there on duty of cooperation, and it says, to the extent necessary to perform this agreement or to protect its interest in the security under this agreement, lessee agrees to assist the owner as requested, even if it requires the execution of government documents to reflect an interest-bearing transaction. So,
We have removed that
Oh.
on request of some customers when it's in our portfolio. But mostly that's being used for when there are recording documents that are required that don't fit the nature of an Islamic financing transaction, but is required by the government.
okay. In case you, so the problem here, as Sheikh Imam mentions, that if there is an interest-bearing transaction, which is obviously not allowed in the Sharia, and so therefore forcing the lessee to take part in that might be questionable, at least. Then in the ijara purchase commitment document, there's also some other issues, and especially this question of what are the steps that are following in the sense of once they buy the property, because obviously in ijara they don't own the property originally. It's not the case that they own the property, but they are going to buy a property again based on the request of a consumer, and then once they buy that property it's going to be flipped over into an ijara relationship with the consumer, right? So there are certain steps that must be met, and Sheikh Salah al-Sawi presents to us some of the conclusions of the Majma al-Fiqhi of some of the requirements. And so it starts actually by talking about one of the prohibited criterion, and that is when the deal involves conclusion of two different contracts at the same time for the same commodity and for the same duration. Again, the rent, you have a purchase agreement and you have a rental agreement. And renting is different from purchasing, and you have to keep those two separate. You have to keep the demands of them separate and so forth. So the permissibility criteria, they say that the presence of two contracts that are totally separate and independent with respect to time. Number two, with respect to the permissibility criteria, there should be a genuine desire from the two parties to conclude the lease contract and not just to use it merely as a veil for the sale contract. Now obviously legally this is very difficult to prove, but we are speaking about between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you can enter into almost any contract with a bad intention, right? You could enter into this kind of contract with the intention that you are not actually interested in leasing, but you are just trying to buy the house with more money over time and essentially borrowing. So there should be a real intent that you are leasing, and the leasing is true. It's not just a facade. It's not just trying to cover the fact that we're just making these payments over time and then at the end you'll be getting the house. And the leased property should be guaranteed by the owner and not by the lessee. Some prohibited forms of the contract, and I talked briefly to the brother, but maybe you can elaborate further on what exactly takes place with Divan. Some prohibited forms of the contract: a lease ending with ownership contract that leads to the transfer of ownership against the amount of rent he's paid during the contract period. In other words, if you are paying rent, and just after paying all that rent, essentially there's no rent plus payment, but it's all essentially rent, and at the end of the rent, the property now becomes yours. Now you have mixed the rental with respect to the lease, the buying, and you don't do that.
No.
Okay.
Our contract has two sets of payments that are made. One is explicitly a purchase commitment amount that has a schedule attached of what those payments are each month. It has a requirement that the customer keep the property leased to an approved tenant. The customer is defined as an approved tenant. So the lease that an approved tenant will enter into is part of the purchase contract, and it says this is the form that you're going to use. The lease payment amounts adjust based on how much has been paid on the purchase commitment.
I know my time is just about up, so I will give you one last point from Dr. Ma'an, and that is regarding default. Default, it says, at its option, the seller may sell the property to a third party and recover from buyer the differences in price obtained, made from the third party, and that which would have been paid by buyer under this commitment. So now the question is, what is meant by what was going to be paid by the buyer? Is it just the principal?
Purchase commitment.
Just the purchase
lease.
commitment. So it's not lease at all. Okay.
Correct.
So Dr. Mayan says this is a simulation between the sale and lease contract is unacceptable, but I think he and also Salah Sawi, they took it to mean both. So if they are separated, inshallah, that answers that. And finally, again, the question of okay. I think I'll stop. I mean, alhamdulillah, I think the points that they both make are pretty clear. The conclusions, though, of the two sheikhs are a little bit different. As I said, Ma'an al-Quda says, having said this, more than one critical violation of the Islamic ijara has been confined in this contract due to all these violations. The contract is not a valid ijara one. It characterizes the relationship between the bank and the client as a lender who advances an interest-bearing loan to a borrower. However, Sheikh Salah Sawi, the question was put to him, is this apt sahih with simply conditions attached to it which are fasid or unacceptable, such that it would be permissible for an individual, a Muslim, given strong need and the purpose behind this, to engage in this contract. And his conclusion is that based on the text that he's seen, he says that the shurut al-fasida, the conditions that are in this contract, which are unacceptable. He said it's permissible for the one who's dealing in this contract to avoid those conditions, because those conditions, as I said, they are mostly kind of exceptional circumstances. They are not necessarily the norm. They talk about like eminent domain and things like that. So he concludes that these shurut al-fasida, these unacceptable shurut, that the person can actually avoid, does not prevent an individual from entering into this contract, especially given the need for such a contract. So there is a slight, I think, difference in conclusion between the two sheikhs in their papers, based on some of the violations, deviations in their contracts. And actually, I think a couple of them, David has explained to us here additionally as well. Thank you. Barakallahu fikum wa assalamu alaikum.
So, ikhwa, if it's okay, inshallah, Mashaykh, for the next 20 minutes, if we could have, sure you can, absolutely. We're going to, inshallah ta'ala, have for these two presenters on their topic specifically with regards to ijara with Divan Bank. We're going to ask that, inshallah, once again, that you line up. We ask that if possible, please, let's try to keep it concise. Let's keep it to one, either a statement or a question, not both of them. This way, inshallah ta'ala, we can try to address everybody as best as possible. And after that, there will be the open session for Q&R, so you'll have plenty of other opportunities, inshallah jalla wa ala. So go ahead and begin, and also tell us who you're addressing it to, please.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm sorry, two things, Number one, it doesn't matter what you're going to call that fees for the late payment. You're going to call it chasing fee, whatever. العلة هو التأخير في الدفع. تسميها زي ما انت عاوزها. ملاحقة المتأخر غرامة على المتأخر، العلة هو التأخير فهو ربا. خلاص زيادة على المبلغ على شيء كده. But what I meant is this: call it any name you want. It's chasing the payer for being late or late payment or whatever it charges. Name it anything you want. The reason you are adding that expenses just because he was late, it's riba, period. إلا إذا كنت على خطأ إن شاء الله. If I'm wrong إن شاء الله الفقهاء كمثال الدكتور الصاوي يصلحني. فالعلة علة تلبسها تحليها تحطها عسل ما نعرف حل. ثانيا the second issue is this: if I steal to donate a needy, it doesn't mean that make it halal. إن الله طيبا ولا يرضى الله طيب. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pure and never accept anything except pure. I to charge that late payment fee and say I'm going to make a donation to the poor and needy, that is twisting the issue. I'm sorry. That's never. The other issue is this: the hadith. I heard the brother saying using that hadith and they chopped it half. That's the second issue. He said al-halal bayn wal-haram bayn. Al-hadith sahih. Halal is clear and haram is clear. And it's authentic hadith from Nu'man bin Bashir. سمعت رسول الله, strong hadith. سمعت رسول الله. But we don't chop it over here. ويل للمصلين and we stop. Where is الذين هم عن صلاتهم ساهون? Where is when it says وبينهما أمور متشابهات لا يعلمون كثير من الناس. And then say فمن اتقى الشبهات فقد استبرأ لدينه وعرضه ومن وقع في الشبهات وقع في الحرام. الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم in this hadith he says it's clearly what's halal, clear what's haram, and between them something questionable, a green area, whatever you want to call it. And Prophet ﷺ, he said, avoid that, because if you approach it, you are falling in the haram. What does it mean? This gray area is closer to the haram or to the halal? Closer to the haram. If the Prophet said that al-mutashabiyat is close to the haram, who am I to get my opinion about Prophet ﷺ? يا الذين آمنوا
جزاك الله خيرا.
And the last thing I'm going to say,
I think you've said more than enough for now, brother. We have plenty of others who also need to.
إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم.
يا مشايخ.
My choice to categorize المتشابهات toward the halal or the haram. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Mashayikh, if it's okay, honestly, we need to respect each other. And we need to have the best of manners towards each other. Everybody's time is valuable. Everybody's concerns are valuable. And we're not here to bash anybody. If we're going to say something, let it be very Islamically correct and professional. Let it be concise, please. We want to all walk away still feeling good about each other in our hearts. And inshallah ta'ala increasing in our iman as well as in our knowledge. So I didn't hear or understand whether there was a question in that. So next.
My first question for Mr. Londi, it's more technical. Since the contract is kind of hiding a sale transaction, so the LLC, just let's say this contract is part of the transfer of ownership transaction, and the LLC is deciding for the title of the house until it's transferred. Does the tenant has any decision-making power over the LLC, if any? Because I didn't see the contract and didn't see the comments.
The LLC is the owner of the property.
And does the tenant or the end buyer have any decision power over the LLC decisions throughout the period of the contract?
What decision power would you have over your landlord if you were renting?
Because at the beginning of the contract, I noticed a comment that it's basically a sales transaction. So this contract is being used.
The contract is arranged between the customer and the LLC at the beginning. And those are the terms that are going to govern the transaction for its duration. Things like what is the rental rate, how is the rental rate going to be calculated, what is the overall term, what is the overall price. All of that is going to be worked out at the beginning of the transaction.
Okay, thanks. Just a quick question for the shuyukh.
If it's okay, just so that once everybody else gets a chance, inshallah.
Okay,
Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Barakallahu feekum. I have maybe a strange question. My question is, and I know that the Majama al-Fiqhiyya, they say that when
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. اللهم جنبنا الزيغ والزلل في القول والعمل، اللهم آمين. مجموعة نقاط سريعة يا أحبابي. يعني أولا نحن هنا يعني لم نأتي ممثلي هذه الشركات لا لكي نحرجهم ولا لكي نضعهم في كورنر. نحن جئنا بهم لكي نتناصح معهم، ونحن ممتنون لهم وشاكرون لهم مجهودهم وداعون لهم بالتوفيق والسداد، ونحن معهم في سفينة واحدة وفي قارب واحد معهم ومع غيرهم من كل من يحاول أن يقدم شيئا لكي يصلح به فسادا أو يقوم به خللا وعوجا. نحن معه إن شاء الله، وأرجو أن تكون هذه الروح هي التي نحملها تجاه إخواننا، ونحملها كذلك تجاه المؤسسات التي يقوم عليها غير المسلمين، هم يقدمون لنا خدمة كذلك، وأرجو أننا ننظر إليها من هذه الزاوية ونجتهد معهم لتطوير الأحوال وتحسينها واستصلاحها. المسألة الثانية، نحن نقدر الحرص على النقاء والحرص على الصفاء، وسمعت أكثر من مرة مشروعية 100%، كلام جميل جدا، لكن قد لا تقدر عليه في الواقع، والقدرة مناط التكليف وشرطه. فيعني الله جل وعلا لا يكلف نفسا إلا وسعها ولا يكلف نفسا إلا ما آتاها، فالمطلوب منا أن نستفرغ وسعنا، أن نستفرغ جهدنا، وأن نبذل وسعنا وطاقتنا في تحصيل ما يمكن تحصيله من الخير، وفي دفع ما يمكن دفعه من الشر. وفي تراثنا الفقهي كثير مما يمكن أن نقف عليه ونستدل به على مثل ذلك. والقاعدة أنه لا ينبغي لأحد أن يعتب على نور فيه ظلمة ما دام لم يحصل له نور لا ظلمة فيه. كلمة مرة ثانية ويكون شيخ الإسلام رحمه الله كان يقول: لا ينبغي لأحد أن يعتب على نور فيه ظلمة ما دام لم يحصل له نور لا ظلمة فيه. يعني في الجملة نحن نستطيع أن نقول يعني أننا أمام خير فيه دخل، فنحن نجتهد في تقليل هذا الدخل ما استطعنا، في توسيع رقعة الضوء والنور ما استطعنا، لكن في النهاية سوف نتعامل مع الواقع. وكلكم وأنتم مشايخ طبعا تعلمون أن شيخ الإسلام رحمه الله يتحدث عن لو أن رجلا دخل مع مكاس مع صاحب مكس من أجل أن يقلل المكوس التي فرضها على الناس، ثم أعانه فجمعها له من الناس، لكن دخل معه بنية تقليل المظالم، يعني فقال إنه بهذا إنما يكون وكيلا عن المظلوم في تقليل المظلمة الواقعة عليه، وليس وكيلا عن الظالم، وليس معينا له على ظلمه. الكلام مش معناه إن احنا نفرط في تحصيل ما يمكن تحصيله من الخير. نحن لابد أن نستفرغ وسعنا وأن نبذل جهدنا ما استطعنا، وأنا عارف أن في النهاية هتصل لحيث سد، سوف تصل في النهاية إلى بعض الفساد الذي لا يمكن إلا أن تقبل به في نهاية المطاف، أو أن تخرج من الساحة والميدان بالكلية. والخروج من الميدان بالكلية ليس خيارا مناسبا، يبقى الخيار الصحيح والذي دائما يتوافق مع مقاصد الشرع، يعني أن مبنى الشريعة على تحصيل أو تحقيق خير الخيرين ودفع شر الشرين، وأن مبنى الشريعة على تحصيل ما يمكن تحصيله من المصالح ودفع ما يمكن دفعه من المفاسد، تحصيل المصالح وتكميلها، وتعطيل المفاسد وتقليلها. يعني ثم يبقى في النهاية إذا بقيت معنا يعني بعض الشروط الفاسدة، هي في ذاتها فاسدة، لكن يمكنك أنت أن تتحاشاها. لو تعاملت مع شركة تبيع عقارات وأصرت على أن تضع شرطا في عقدها أن من تأخر عليه أن يدفع غرامة التأخير، يعني نحن لا نعتقد جواز هذا ديانة، لكننا نستطيع أن ندفعه عن أنفسنا عمليا. نستطيع أننا نلتزم بالوفاء بالتزاماتنا في مواقيتها، فنبطل هذا الشرط من الناحية التطبيقية. وتعلمون أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عندما أرادت عائشة أن تشتري بريرة، يعني أن تسهم في عتقها وأن تعجل لها هذا، فاشترط أولياؤها أن يكون ولاؤها له، والولاء بمعنى الإرث. فجاءت أمنا عائشة تشتكي للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لأن القاعدة أن الولاء لمن أعتق. فقال لها النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، يعني قال لها اشتريها واشترطي لهم، فإنما الولاء لمن أعتق. يعني كأنه يقول لها إن هذا الشرط شرط فاسد، يعني سوف تبطله الشريعة وتلغيه، شرط لا اعتبار له ولا صحة به. يعني وإذا وقف به أصحابه لكي يجعلوه عرضة دون تحقيق شيء من الخير أو لم شر من الشر، يعني فنحن نقبله نظريا ثم نجتهد في تطبيقه في دفعه وفي تعطيله عمليا. وبهذه الصورة يمكننا أن احنا لا نقيم خصومة بين الشريعة والواقع. يعني بالنسبة لنقطة مسألة الغرامات التأخيرية دائما ربا، القاعدة صحيحة، لكن يعني مما أثبتته هيئة المعايير أنه يمكن أن تفرض زيادة لا ينتفع بها الدائن، إنما تحول إلى جهة خيرية المقصود بها الضغط على المدين لكي لا يتفلت. والناس إذا لم يجدوا ضغطا عليهم ربما يعني يتكاسلون ويفرطون ويحدث جملة من الخلل، لأن الديون التجارية غير الديون المدنية، لأن أي إخلال يبنى عليه سلسلة من إخلالات ربما تنهار بناية كاملة بسبب إخلال واحد صغير. ففي يعني شيء من الفقه في أن يقال لابد أن تكون عندنا وسائل للضغط على المدين غير المعسر، المدين المماطل لي الواجد يحل عرضه وعقوبته. تعلمون أن مطل الغني ظلم يحل عرضه وعقوبته. فإذا واحد متكاسل المال عنده لكنه مفرط مهمل متكاسل، فمن حق المؤسسة أنها تبحث عن وسائل. فمن بين هذه الوسائل قالوا تحميله المصروفات يعني القضائية. إذا رفعت عليه دعوة أمام المحكمة من حق المصروفات التقاضي والمحامي يتحمله هذا المدين المماطل الظالم بمطلبه. نحن لا نتكلم عن مدين معسر مضطر في الشارع لا، نحن نتكلم عن مدين قادر واجد، لأن الحديث يقول كما ذكرت لحضراتكم لي الواجد يحل عرضه وعقوبته. الحديث الثاني مطل الغني ظلم، يفرق بين الغني وبين المعسر. ومن حق يعني المؤسسة أن تبحث عن جملة من التدابير الاحترازية التي تحول دون مطله والتي توقع عليه شيئا من الضغط إذا ماطل لكي ترده إلى الصواب. ويعني نحن في النهاية لن نكون موقفا نهائيا بعد، لا نزال نستمع وسنستمع وسوف نستمع إن شاء الله، لأن الفتوى معرفة الواجب في الواقع. لكي تكون الفتوى دقيقة وصحيحة لابد أن نحسن الاستماع جيدا مع التقدير الجيد لكل كلمة تخرج من فم إخواننا، ونعطي أنفسنا فرصة لتدبرها وتأملها. ونحن لما نصل إلى موقف نهائي في أي شركة البعث لا نزال نستمع وسوف نستمع، وسوف تكون لنا جلسات أخرى طويلة بعد يعني مع أعضاء لجنة الفتوى بإذن الله، حتى يعني ينهج لنا نهج قاصد بين بإذن الله. أسأل الله لكم التوفيق والسداد والرشاد. السلام عليكم.